So those of you who have heard me speak before might have heard me say this is the most exciting lecture I've ever given about various topics, about feline upper respiratory infections, so the breakthroughs we've made in that area. And then when the guidelines for standards of care came out in 2010, that was the most exciting thing ever. But I'm here to say this is really it. This is the most exciting thing that I've had the privilege of talking about. And really, even though there's a point about midway through this presentation where it gets pretty depressing, you just need to trust me. This is the thing I've been waiting for 25 years in animal sheltering. This is the thing I'm so grateful that my career spanned this new understanding of how to manage cats in shelters and in communities, and that I get to be one of the people who are sharing this information. This is something that has turned out to be so much better, so much easier, so much more hopeful than I ever could have imagined when I was first working in a shelter 25 years ago. So I'll start with a little bit about how I got here. This is me in 1976, dressed up as a kitten, just because. It wasn't a special holiday or Halloween or anything. And at that time, my nickname was Little Cat Hurley. And my earliest ambition, in fact, was to run a cat hotel. And I spent a lot of time as a kid drawing out the diagrams of the hands that would stick out of the wall at cat height so they could get petted automatically anytime they wanted, and there was going to be a mouse roller coaster on the roof of the hotels, and the cats could ride around in the cars afterwards so they could chase the mice without ever having to break a sweat. So I've been invested and engaged by cats for as long as I can remember. But, as I grew up, this is me 15 years later, still crazy about cats, but now needing to have a job. And, looking back at that picture, I can still remember the pride that I felt in wearing that uniform and in working for the Santa Cruz SPCA. I can still remember the care that I took with each cat that I had responsibility for bringing into the shelter. But also, I can still remember what the chances were for that cat. At that time, at that shelter, about 1 in 4 cats left alive. If she had been feral, there was no holding period at that time. It would have been my job, and it's something I did many times, to march straight back to the euthanasia room, shake her to the bottom of that wire cage, and give her a lethal injection through the wire. And I did that. I went out, picked up trapped, healthy cats. I was good at transferring them into those little wire cages. I was good at euthanizing them. I did that even though I loved cats so much. I did it for the cats themselves, because I believed that the cats would suffer a much worse fate if they were left to fend for themselves. They were pets. They weren't adapted to be on their own in the environment. And I did it because I saw my responsibility as bigger than any one cat. I saw my responsibility as being for all the pet cats in the community. I needed to protect them from the diseases that could be carried by feral and stray cats if they are allowed to just breed and live unchecked. I saw my responsibility to all the animals in the community, to the wildlife, as well as the pet animals. And working at a shelter that also had the animal control contract, I had a responsibility to the people in the community to protect public health from the diseases that could be carried by cats and to address the concerns of the citizens in our community. Ultimately, I did it because the big brass ring we were all working for at that shelter and still at shelters everywhere, every single day, was to get ahead of feline overpopulation and bringing cats in, and if we couldn't find them homes, euthanizing them was the best way we knew how to do that. Fast forward yet another few years, and I went on to do a residency in shelter medicine, and still obsessed with cats. And my research focused on feline upper respiratory infection, and some of you out there either listening today or hearing this later on in webinar land will have heard me talk about this. And I'm standing in front of the cage from the study that was our great breakthrough in controlling feline upper respiratory infection. And if you look closely, it's just a little bigger than the cages we've been accustomed to providing for cats. And that was so incredible to me. It's so easy. All we need is 8 square feet of floor space and just reasonable protection from stress, reasonable level of daily monitoring and care. And we can defeat this disease that has been a scourge of animal sheltering since the beginning of time, as far as anybody knows. But when I went out and tried to share this news, I ran up against the fact that a lot of shelters didn't feel like they could provide even that 8 square feet of floor space because of the onslaught of cats. And I ran into too many shelters where more cats were admitted healthy than were released alive. And some of you know all too well what can happen then. Crowding happens, lapses in care happens, stress happens, and cats that came in the door healthy end up being euthanized for upper respiratory infection because respiratory infection is an inevitable consequence of crowding and stress for cats. And that was intensely frustrating to me. I felt like waiting for cats that came in healthy to get sick and then euthanizing them for illness that we created was one of the worst things that we could force ourselves into doing as shelters. And so I created algorithms for shelters to euthanize cats while they were still healthy, to predict which ones wouldn't get adopted, and take the proactive step of taking their lives as humanely as possible, because I didn't see a better alternative. And then, a few years ago, seeing some new things and putting old information together in a new way, I came to a disturbing realization, which is that maybe I had it right way back when I was 10, and I was planning a cat hotel that really met the needs of cats. And maybe all the things that I had been doing since then, with the best intentions possible, with my best interpretation of the information that I had at that time and the experiences that I had already had, I got it wrong. So this talk is both my delight to give, because I love the news that's in it, and also my penance. I think that I've got it right this time. I promise if I get more information and have some more experiences, I will let you know. So here's a couple of critters that I might see when I walk out of my office. In fact, these are critters that I do see when I walk out my office door. On the left is a cat. I don't know by looking at her whether she's a pet or whether she's an unowned creature, adapted to living in the wild, although not a wild species, but able to breed and thrive in many environments, even without an owner. And so I can't tell just by looking at her whether it would be a great idea to bring her into a shelter in the hopes she would be reunited with her owner, because I don't even know if she has an owner. I don't know whether I bring her into the shelter, whether she will be adapted to the one live outcome that most shelters have been able to offer historically, which is adoption into a pet home. If I look at that rabbit on the right, He's the same species as the animal that we keep as pets, domestic bunny rabbits. But he looks visually different enough that I know he's not a pet. And so I can recognize immediately that it would not be productive for me to bring him into the shelter in the hopes that his owner is going to come looking for him during the stray holding period. I know that it wouldn't be helpful for me to bring him in and see if he settles down and then try and adopt him into a home. Or find a barn home for him if he doesn't tame down that I can relocate him into. And I know, even if there's concern about jackrabbits causing nuisances, which there are in my community, even if horses are falling in the holes and breaking their legs, I recognize that picking him up, bringing him into the shelter, holding him in a stainless steel cage for a stray holding period, giving him a lethal injection, and incurring the costs of incinerating or chemically rendering his body is not going to be a productive way of managing jackrabbits in our community. This is one of the things that is so challenging with cats. They exist on a continuum, and there's no obvious visual marker to distinguish where on the continuum a cat is. And in fact, cats can move fluidly between different areas of the continuum, from being a cherished pet in a home, in a cat hotel with a petting machine and a roller coaster, to being an unowned but social, friendly, handleable cat, to being an unsocial, unhandleable, or feral cat. Feral cats can sometimes tame down. Social cats can turn feral or have feral young. But the socialization status of the cat does not in itself determine its ability to thrive in an environment, provided it's given the right environment in which to thrive. And this is the thing that makes sheltering of cats so very challenging. In the United States, we have 74 to 86 million pet cats. That's already a lot to try and deal with as shelters. But here's the thing. We have another population that's between 50% and about the same as the size of the pet population. And that is the unowned, free-roaming cat population. In the past, sheltering programs have really been targeted at controlling the pet population. So we've invested heavily in spay-neuter and educational efforts that are targeted at owners and pets that will reduce shelter intake, right? A low-cost spay-neuter program isn't going to touch a wild jackrabbit because there's no owner to catch that jackrabbit and drive it into the clinic, no matter if it's free. We think that animals admitted to the shelter have owners who might come looking for them, but we talked about that with the jackrabbit. Nobody's ever going to come, no matter how long we hold it as a stray. And we've operated on the premise that animals admitted to the shelter could be adopted, if not reclaimed, if only we try hard enough. So we've invested heavily in adoption and marketing efforts, gotten much smarter about promotion and pricing and outreach and open adoptions. All of those can enormously benefit animals that are fundamentally suited to be pets. So how's that working out for you out there in webinar land? Well, I'll tell you some good news. It's working out pretty darn well. Take a moment to congratulate yourselves, sheltering profession. We've done great. This is the drop in euthanasia per thousand capita and in absolute numbers killed over time. We've seen a dramatic decrease since the 1970s. And that hasn't just been a convenient miracle that's happened. That has been the result of hard work, of spay-neuter, of education, of adoption programs, of cooperation between organizations, all the good things that we have done. But, and it's a big but when it comes to cats, you already know this. Here are some large-scale studies that show the difference between what's happening for cats and what's happening for dogs on a per 1,000 capita basis. Ohio, 1996 to 2004, cat intake and euthanasia up about 10%, at the same time that dog euthanasia decreased by 40%. Colorado, 2000 to 2007, cat intake up 20%, euthanasia up 36%, at the same time that dog intake decreased and euthanasia held steady. My own state, California, cat intake and euthanasia up about 25%. So frustrating, all the efforts we made in that decade, the same time that dog euthanasia decreased by over 30%. Even for those shelters that have seen a decrease in cat intake and euthanasia, for the most part, it's not been as dramatic as it has been for dogs. So we're seeing progress, but we're not seeing progress of the same magnitude in many cases as we have for dogs. And for most of this talk, I talk a lot about numbers and statistics. Intake up 36%, euthanasia up 23%. But I want to take it for a moment to the level of an individual animal. This is the Cat Who Loved Kittens. This is from a video that was done back in the 80s, back in my day. This is an actual picture of her. And it's funny, I'm standing here in a room. I've told this story about 50 times now, and it still gets me. She was a stray, domestic long-haired, blue cream tortoiseshell, brought to our shelter 29 days ago. She was a very pretty cat. She loved kittens. She didn't have any with her when she came in, but when she was allowed out of her cage for exercise, she would run up to the cages with kittens in them and try to clean them by licking them. On the days that our shelter was closed, I'd let her out of the cage to stretch out on my desk, and she'd try to play with my pen while I tried to do my paperwork. 2 weeks ago, she became the cat who had been at our shelter the longest. So I had her photographed and made her pet of the week in our local newspaper. Unfortunately, not one person called. No one cared that she was beautiful. No one cared that she got along with dogs and cats. No one cared that she was young, or that she had silky fur, or that she liked to clean kittens or stretch out on a desk or play with a pen. Those of you who work in shelters know what happened next. Today, when other unwanted cats came through our door, filling our cat room beyond capacity, I lovingly took her life. I'm going to give you an opportunity to look away now. The next picture is cats euthanized one summer morning at a shelter that's half an hour from my house. If you can bear to look, you'll see a pretty typical representation of the variety of cats that lose their lives on a typical day in a typical shelter in a typical community in America. You can see that there's a variety of ages, some young kittens. Maybe the shelter didn't have the resources to put together a foster program because they were dealing with cats beyond their capacity. Maybe some of those cats came in feral and couldn't be placed in a home or a barn home, and so they were euthanized. Maybe some of those cats came in healthy and then got upper respiratory infection and then got pneumonia and then were euthanized. See one cat towards the edge that has a flea collar on? Maybe that was somebody's pet. Maybe they didn't know where the shelter was or that they should go to the shelter. Maybe they went every day for a month and the cat came in a week after that, as cats sometimes do. This morning has played out in California over 10 years to amount to over 2.5 million cats, over 250,000 in 1 year, 756 cats every single day. What is the cost? That is the largest single investment we are making in our communities in responding to homeless and unwanted animals. Cats enter shelters in greater numbers, and euthanasia remains the most common outcome. So that's the thing we're putting our money into. Not just what is the cost for cats and what is the cost in resources, but what is the cost for us? What does it cost when we ask people who love animals to do this task as a part of every single day? What does it mean to take people who dressed up as cats when they were kids, who love animals more than anything, who we're relying on to take care of the unwanted pets in our communities, to safeguard lost animals, to promote animals that need homes, to clean and feed and care every single day, to make this also a part of what we do. And finally, what is the opportunity cost? What are we not doing? What opportunities are we not seeing? Where are we not investing? Because we're investing so much in this. Here's the bottom line. In California, in most shelters, in most communities across North America, more cats are admitted healthy than are released alive. Whether it's 1 or 100 or 1,000 or 10,000, or as in the last 10 years in California, 2.5 million. Why? Why would we do such a thing? Why would we incur such terrible costs? For good reason. Not because we're cruel or thoughtless, but because we have these goals as shelters. We have to abide by the law, especially if we're a shelter that has an animal control contract or is an animal control shelter. That's a huge part of our responsibility. We need to resolve citizen complaints and concerns, all the things I was thinking about when I was an animal control officer in 1989. We want to reunite lost pets with their owners, maintain health and welfare of the animals in the shelter, find new homes for pets, euthanize suffering and dangerous animals, mitigate all the harms associated with free-roaming animal populations, whether for wildlife or people or the animals themselves, and ultimately to reduce pet overpopulation. Great goals, goals that I always have been and always will be proud to be associated with. But here's a question, and it's a very specific question. How does admitting healthy cats, just healthy cats, in excess of the capacity for humane care or number released alive, serve these goals? So we're not talking about admitting sick or injured or orphaned cats. We're not talking about admitting cats in balance with the number released alive, but just with admitting healthy cats in excess of the capacity for care and live release. Let's look at that. Remember, I promised you it's depressing and then it gets better. First of all, abide by relevant laws. And I thought, lived in California for much of my life, worked in shelters, worked with shelters. I thought we had to take in cats. There is no law in California that says shelters have to take in cats. It's a choice. Even if you have to hold them once you take them in. So once you take in a cat, a stray holding period kicks in California. But you have no obligation to take it in the first place. So that's a choice. Then, in some communities, there may be an obligation to take in injured, sick, dangerous animals or animals causing an extraordinary nuisance, but no obligation to take in healthy animals not causing any particular hazard. There may be different obligations regarding stray or owner-surrendered animals that give you flexibility. Even if you have to take them and you have to take them all, The obligation is not always to take them immediately if you don't immediately have the capacity for humane care or a positive outcome. And for a lot of shelters, it may feel like it's the law, but it actually turns out to be a contract, and a contract that is up for renegotiation on a periodic basis. And so it's a decision that can be revisited and a choice that can be changed if it turns out it doesn't serve cats, it doesn't serve shelters, and it doesn't serve the community well. So in the vast majority of cases, abiding by the law does not mean necessarily taking in healthy cats in excess of the number released alive. So what about this next one? This was important to me as an animal control officer. If I didn't resolve citizen complaints and concerns, then the county supervisor heard about it, then my boss heard about it, then I heard about it. Actually, there was all kinds of things that we heard about. And this was a big one. People were also annoyed by raccoons. People were also annoyed by possums. And they wanted us to take care of that too. But did we take that raccoon into the shelter? What is the trash can thinks, I don't want to bother myself by putting on a lid. So, just make this problem go away. But the raccoon is like, put a lid on the trash can. We didn't refuse to take in raccoons and kill them for people because we were such raccoon advocates. Why didn't we take in the raccoons or offer to euthanize them or suggest that someone have wildlife control come out to euthanize them? Because it wouldn't work. Unless you wipe out all the raccoons in a large radius, if that trash is still sitting there, another raccoon will come. When we remove a cat that's causing a nuisance or a concern without resolving the situation that attracted that cat, that gave rise to that nuisance or concern, we don't solve the problem. We create a problem for ourselves, and we support sustaining the problem because we offer a false solution. And a really interesting thing, when we work in shelters, we work with the people, we interface with the people who are bothered by cats, especially if we've had an animal control role, and one of the consequences of admitting unowned feral cats has been euthanasia. We only see the people who are sort of okay with that. So we get a skewed idea of what the public prefers. But this was a very large study that actually asked the question, what would you do about unowned cats in the street? And when the choices really were leave the cats alone or trap and kill the cats, when that was really the consequence, then the vast majority of people, over 80%, said, oh, well, if those are the real choices, just leave them alone. So we serve the majority of citizens, of taxpayers, of people who support animal control when we resolve the situation in a different way than by lethal response. So, admitting healthy cats in excess of the number released alive, not the best way to either resolve citizen complaints and concerns or serve the preferences of the majority of people in most communities. What about this one? If you work in shelters, you're already going to see the answer to this one coming. Reunite lost pets with owners. We already know only about 1 in 50 cats, 2%, is reclaimed nationally. We know that cats are much more likely to permanently disappear from households than dogs are, and probably some of that, at least, is like that cat with the flea collar in the picture of the Cat's Euthanized. They come into shelters way after anyone ever thought that they were lost or thought to look in the shelter. And here's a study I had read before, but I revisited it. This is some of the new information that I came upon. Cats are more than 13 times more likely to return home by a non-shelter means than by a shelter means. People just don't call and visit shelters to find their lost cats. It's not in the vocabulary of how people respond to their cat going missing. And part of that is just the difference between the role of cats and dogs in our lives. if your Labrador goes missing, you immediately notice. You're like, definitely there was a Labrador in my kitchen this morning, and there's no Labrador here now. I better go to the shelter, and make some calls and figure out what's going on. Whereas for the cat, oftentimes a few days can go by. If it's an indoor-outdoor cat, you're like, have you seen the cat? I haven't seen. I'm not sure I've seen the cat. Well, I think there's some food gone. And sometimes by the time looking kicks in, it's already too late. And for many people, lower income people tend to own cats. People's relationships with cats tend to be much less formal. There's not even the thought of going to a shelter and looking for a cat. 66% of lost cats are found because they return home on their own. So actually, by refraining from taking cats into the shelter, we actually increase the possibility that they will be reunited with their owner, especially if we support the person finding the cat in making efforts to reunite the cat with the owner in their own neighborhood by knocking on doors, putting up flyers, posting it on Craigslist, and keeping the cat in the community where it's most likely to be reunited. Okay, so we can knock that one off the list. And now we come to one that is near and dear to my heart. This was so important to me as a shelter worker, that no matter what the outcome for every animal in our care, while it was in our care, it would have good care. It wouldn't suffer. The shelter would be a safe haven, even if it was only for a few days. We have to have enough resources to provide for health and welfare. Is this enough? I've purposely chosen cages that are not among the worst. They're a little bit bigger or a little bit brighter than many. They've got a little bit of enrichment in them. But still, there's not adequate space for a cat to take a few unimpeded steps, for a cat to stretch to full body length, for a cat to have adequate separation between its litter and its food and its water. And what we now know is that those are the conditions that we need to maintain the health and welfare of cats. So this was a study that showed the probability of upper respiratory infection in cats in a pretty typical shelter. This is actually a shelter in Massachusetts. And you can see that the probability of upper respiratory infection reached over 90% by the time the cats had been in the shelter for a little over 2 weeks. Basically, they were either adopted or they got sick. And many shelters are still struggling with upper respiratory infection. We did a study that compared upper respiratory infection rates in shelters across North America, and we found one shelter that had an upper respiratory infection rate consistently less than 5% of the cats that came in the door. So fewer than 1 in 20 cats got sick in their care. We analyzed over 49 factors of husbandry, housing, vaccination, disinfection, exposure to dogs, exposure to volunteers, daily care, and this is what it came down to. Floor space for initial intake housing greater than 9 square feet, and compartmentalized cages that allowed limited movement for daily cleaning and care. So they could just be tucked into one side of the cage, other side of the cage tidied up, move to the other side, tidied up, no having to put them in a carrier, take them out, move them to another cage. By a happy coincidence, we also found that these cages were profoundly important for welfare. So this is the stress score by day and the euthanasia risk for cats. And you can see the blue line is the stress score in a small traditional cage. This is the cage. So set up as best we could with the bed to maximize height and the food and water over here to maximize the separation from the litter box. The stress score in this cage started out not statistically significantly different from the stress score in this slightly larger cage that had a 3-foot compartment and then a 1-foot side about cubby for the litter box to be separated from the food. And you can see, though, this is the dividing line between stressed and relaxed. By day 2, in the larger cages, cats had already dropped to a relaxed state on average. We could already see the cats that were going to be good candidates for adoption or rescue. They told us that by 48 hours in the shelter. And that was very important for this shelter because behavior was a big factor in the decision about whether to put a cat up for adoption or not, or make it available for rescue. In the small cage, even by day 7, on average, it was barely dipping towards that line. So it took days longer, and many cats never made it to the relaxed state, even when fundamentally they weren't feral cats. It was just the conditions of housing. So the same requirement that we have for health, we have for welfare as well. And this is also very well documented. At least 18 square feet of floor space for cats in group housing is a requirement for welfare. So when we house cats like this, we give ourselves no way to win. The reason we house cats like this is because we admit more than are released alive or than we have capacity to care for, because capacity for humane care means providing a little more space than this. So, next on our list, find new homes for pets. Here's a great goal. This is the fun part of sheltering, right? Told you about all the improvements, all the work we've done in California with marketing, with posting cats on the web, with 10-for-1 adoptions, with hiding them in people's purses when they come to visit the shelter. We're doing great. We've gone from 60,000 adoptions to over 80,000 adoptions. Yay. It's working. But remember what I told you about cat euthanasia. During that time, cat intake increased even more than adoptions did. And so cat euthanasia rose in spite of our best efforts. And here's the thing about cats. We are not the only game in town. So even if I could give you all $1 million grants so that you could capture more of the market for cats, so that we could get more people to come to shelters and adopt instead of getting their cats from another source, this is not a demand-driven market. So if we take some of the demand away from cats for other sources, people won't suddenly think, oh, I better not have an unwanted litter of kittens. Right? So shelters have about 30% of the pie. Different studies vary for about how much it is, from 35% to less than 5%, depending on what population you're surveying. But this is a big national study from the American Pet Products Manufacturers Association, so probably pretty representative broadly. What's the next biggest source? Friend, relative. This is not someone who bred their cat and is selling the kittens as a way to bring in a little extra coin, right? This is like, oh, I can't keep my cat. I'm moving. It's attacking the baby, whatever it is. I had a litter of kittens. Do you want one? If those don't get rehomed in the community, they don't disappear. What happens? They end up in the shelter. The next biggest category of where people get cats is stray. If those cats don't get rehomed in the community, what's going to happen? They're either going to continue to be out and about, or they're going to end up in the shelter. The good news of this bad news is that the chances for rehoming for a cat that does not come into the shelter is not nil. And if that cat is in excess of the number that we can release alive, then we can say the chances for rehoming is 0 if it's in excess of the number we release alive, and it's not 0 if it remains in the community. And if we're not overwhelmed by intake of healthy cats beyond our capacity, we have more ability to support the community in responsibly rehoming cats themselves. So we can provide spay, neuter, and vaccination and identification microchipping services for cats that are rehomed within the community. If people adopt a stray cat, let's make it easy for them to get that cat spayed and neutered. people have an unwanted litter of kittens, let's make it easier for them to get mom spayed and neutered and place the kittens with people who can also get them spayed and neutered. So we can do that education, information, and reach out to the community as long as our resources aren't completely overwhelmed on site. And this is not just for people's pet cats. This is also true for stray cats. So here's a pair of pie charts. And the pie chart on the left is just feline outcomes from shelters in California. I use California because we have a very broad data set for California, because there's required reporting by shelters in this state. And so you can see the biggest piece of the pie in California is euthanized, and then we have adopted, and then we have another chunk that's rescue and transfer, and another chunk that's returned to the owners. And so those are all live outcomes, so that's the green parts of the pie. And then on the right, we have feline outcomes from a shelter that said, you know what, we're just not going to take in more cats than we have the capacity to provide humane care and release alive within a reasonable time frame. So during the summer, they got over 700 cats on their wait list, and they were pretty nervous. But what they found is that of those 700, 400 didn't end up coming in when there was room and capacity to provide good care and a live outcome. And here's how the pie played out. Look at the green piece of the pie is almost the reverse in terms of live versus not live outcomes. So 59% either rehomed the cat themselves or kept it. So all those people became unwitting off-site adoption mini centers. But the good news is they didn't work or volunteer for shelters, so all their Facebook friends weren't completely overwhelmed with their pathetic postings of cats every single day. So they had a new set of coworkers and neighbors and friends to inflict these cats on. So they were very successful. About the same percentage, 6%, took it to another shelter or rescue. That was the same percent as were transferred to another shelter for shelters in California. And the same percent were able to find the owner and reunite the pet with their owner. So by leaving it in the community until there was capacity for care, much better outcomes were found. Only 1% were known to have been hit by a car, so that was definitely a bad outcome. And the remaining 32%, they just weren't able to reach, and it never came in. So we don't know that that was a bad outcome. We just don't know for sure that it was a good one. We only have 3 to go. But this is an important one. Euthanize suffering or dangerous animals. And so important that I'm going to break down each of those words. Euthanize, suffering, dangerous. So first of all, suffering. This was a big part of my rationale for euthanizing those unowned cats that came into the shelter and that we couldn't place. I believed they would suffer. In spite of the evidence of my own eyes, that many times when I picked them up, when I brought them in, when I euthanized them, they weren't suffering. They were in reasonable body condition. They didn't have serious wounds or injuries. They weren't sick when they came into the shelter's care. And that is also played out in TNR clinics, where less than 1% of over 100,000 cats spayed and neutered through TNR clinics were euthanized because they were suffering or sick. And this was TNR clinics across the United States, from the moist, funky South to the frigid North. Cats that come into our care, for the most part, are doing all right. We looked at the body condition of cats coming into a local shelter. It was a rock-solid 5 out of 9. Ideal. More healthy than all the obese cats that are lounging, for instance, the obese cat that's lounging on my bed right now at home. The annual survival rate of cats that have some access to a food source, some access to shelter, so not owned, but semi-owned, free-roaming cats, is 90%, strikingly similar to a common definition of a no-kill shelter. Even for cats entirely without care, the mortality rate is about 50%. The mortality, only 1 in 8 lion cubs survive. I happen to know that fact. So that's a high mortality rate. But we still don't think it would be a good idea to euthanize that last one. because the chances for survival are low. So this question was a headline in a news story. Feral cats deserve care, not abandonment. And I do believe pet cats deserve care, not abandonment. But euthanasia is not care. And allowing an animal to remain in an environment to which it is adapted, sterilizing it and vaccinating it to help it thrive in that environment is not abandonment. So, healthy cats, we're not euthanizing to prevent suffering. What about this dangerous thing? Some of you may have seen this poll, came out last year. 7 in 10 pet owners say shelters should kill only animals too sick or aggressive for adoption. And even though we might categorize feral cats as behaviorally unsound for adoption, that's not what the public means when they say aggressive. This is the thing that actually gives us so much more flexibility with cats than with dogs. Maybe we can't solve the pit bull problem by sterilizing them and releasing them back to the streets. But cats do not, for the most part, create a real hazard. They don't pack up and bring down small children and old ladies in the street. So we have flexibility in the way that we can respond to them in terms of aggression towards humans. Absolutely. If there's a rabid cat, if there's a cat that's particularly actively aggressive, that's chasing down people, that's something that we should respond to in a different way. And maybe euthanasia is the best solution in that situation, but that's not the situation for the vast majority of cats. And so then we come to this final word, euthanize. It's a word that I have said hundreds of thousands of times. When I first got my job at the Santa Cruz SPCA, I had to write a little essay about how I would feel working at a shelter that sometimes euthanized healthy animals. And I wrote that, that would be hard, but I would feel okay as long as I was working actively every day towards a time when that would no longer be necessary. So that's what euthanize meant to me. Here's an article from the Orlando Sentinel, published last year. And actually, I couldn't find the version of the article that didn't have this word blocked out, but there are 2 effective, humane alternatives to the cat hell of TNR. One is, the word that's blacked out is Tylenol. The human pain medication, a completely selective feral cat poison. I don't think any of us would feel okay about suggesting to communities that an acceptable way of managing our own cat populations would be to distribute Tylenol. The other, and by the way, it's not a completely selective feral cat poison, so out there in webinar land, scratch that from the list. The other is trap and euthanize. We have presented trap and euthanize as a humane alternative. It says here that it's practiced by state and federal wildlife managers. But what's the reality? Who actually practices it? Animal shelters. Animal shelter workers who love cats. That's who does it. Without us, this wouldn't be an option in the United States. So I want you to think for yourself for a moment. How do you define euthanasia? And if you haven't done this recently, I challenge you to go into a shelter and stand in front of a cage that is housing a feral or frightened cat. And time 1 minute. And allow yourself to really take in the experience of that cat. Take in the smells of chemicals, of urine. Go in before cleaning or during cleaning. Take in the sounds of barking dogs, of slamming doors. See the body posture of the cat, the dilated pupils, the tension. Think about what is natural for that cat, if that is an unowned, free-roaming cat. Multiply that minute by all the minutes that that cat will spend in a shelter before death. And think about whether we even have the ability to provide a thing called euthanasia for a feral or fearful cat that has to be held in a shelter, no matter how painless or skillfully given the final injection might be. It's not an option. And the more widely we communicate that to the public, the sooner we can come to understand as a society that that is not a tool available to us, period. So here we come to the last big two. One, mitigate harm associated with free-roaming animals. There was just an article in the paper here about the hazards posed by feral cats, many of whom have been sterilized, but who are living along the river in Sacramento. The hazards to wildlife, the hazards to people. What is our responsibility to mitigate those harms? This is the question that sometimes is asked plain out and sometimes is just implied. Must cats die so birds can live? If we stop euthanizing healthy cats, if we do something else instead, is that going to be devastating to another equally precious, equally important population? I want to revisit how I got here. The Santa Cruz SPCA, at the time I worked there, and I worked there for 6 years, didn't just have dogs and cats, we also did wildlife rehab. So I witnessed every day, not just the suffering of unowned and homeless animals in our community, but also the injured birds, the injured little critters brought in by cats. And this was another great love of mine. This is me holding a baby otter, and you can see the striking resemblance in our teeth. Along with my plans to build a cat hotel, I loved otters so much that in first grade, instead of speaking English, I barked because I thought I was speaking Otterese. And my teacher thought maybe I was autistic, but I just didn't understand. But, I am just as crazy about otters as I am about cats. I feel just as strong a responsibility to all animals as I do to pet animals. But we need to acknowledge just the fundamental limits of our superpowers as shelters. Here's another question, very similar, right? Must cats die so birds can live? Should we kill them, coyotes, or leave them alone? This is an important question. They prey on sheep. They prey on game mammals. They create all kinds of nuisances and hazards. But maybe before we ask whether we should kill them or leave them alone, we should ask whether it's even possible to kill them at all. There's a lot of coyotes running around. They're efficient scavengers. They're highly adaptable. They're efficient breeders. Does it remind you of any other species that you know? It's hard to kill enough coyotes. This was a model for coyote populations. The population survived indefinitely when 70% of its members were killed. So if you killed 70 out of 100 coyotes, the population survives indefinitely. Declines to zero in about 50 years as long as you kill 75% every year. That's going to be hard to do. Same types of studies have been done with cats, and the information is clear. At least 50% removal is required for eradication. Just like with coyotes, if we don't achieve eradication, we don't achieve anything. They breed to replace the animals that have been removed, and there are just as many tomorrow as there was today. We have 30 to 80 million unowned cats in the United States. That data comes from the same data that raises the concerns about cats and predation on wildlife. So that's the data used to generate the cat predation estimates. 2 million cats euthanized in U.S. shelters. For us, 2 million is huge. For cat eradication, for protection of wildlife, 2 million is nothing. It might as well be nothing. We would have to up our euthanasia 8 to 20-fold in every shelter, in every community across America. So the question we should be asking before we argue about must cats die is, can cats die so birds can live? And the same argument applies to the human health risk. Release of feral cats into communities without continuous veterinary care for annual vaccinations and other health needs is inhumane and irresponsible. Feral cats pose serious disease risks to pet cats, dogs, people, according to a University of Tennessee veterinarian. This is exactly the information that I had as an animal control officer that made me so earnestly go out and get all those cats. These diseases, some of which are fatal to people and pets, include rabies, plague, tularemia, murine typhus, toxoplasmosis, feline AIDS, feline leukemia, cat scratch disease, hookworm infection, and others. The list is long. But the same question exists. Can we eradicate enough cats to eliminate the health hazards? If we eradicate just 40%, they will replace themselves. They will replace their toxoplasma risk. They won't be rabies vaccinated because they won't have been part of a TNR program. So they will continue to be a risk to public health. We will continue to destabilize cat populations, remove cats from situations to which they were adapted, and leave that niche open for another cat to come, breed, have more kittens that will be a brand new risk for toxo, hookworm, and all those other things that most commonly affect kittens and young growing cats. We would need a massive, grand-scale, intensive effort. That is not what we're doing. Shelter euthanasia is not the result of a plan where we went out and analyzed the community and the areas that are ecologically sensitive and then put together a plan to actually achieve the level of eradication, whether by removal and relocation or euthanasia or any other means, to actually eliminate important populations. It's not timed with the breeding cycle of the cat. It's generated by citizens. One day they decide they're annoyed or worried about a cat, and they bring it in. It's not focused on colonies. Oftentimes, it's someone just bringing in 1, 2, 3 cats, all the way up to someone I recently talked to. They brought in over 200 cats, but one at a time, over a period of months and years. Capture, transport, holding, lethal injection, and disposal at a shelter is far more costly and time-consuming than the lethal methods that have been used in successful eradication campaigns. The top 3 methods in successful campaigns are traps, hunting, and poison. The scope is not nearly sufficient to impact the size of the population. So going back to the coyotes, lethal control measures, short of eradication, appear no more effective in the long term than no lethal control at all. All the effort that's been spent gunning down coyotes, trapping them, poisoning them, if it doesn't lead to eradication, it's no different than having done nothing. And here's the reality as it played out. With rifles, snares, and aerial gunning, employees have killed almost 1,000 coyotes, 45 mountain lions at a cost of over $500,000. Like a mirage, the dream of protecting deer by killing predators has not materialized. More theory about coyote control. As long as private livestock producers can externalize the costs of predator losses via government-subsidized predator control, they will have little incentive for responsible husbandry techniques. If we think we're solving the problem by killing some of the predators, then we won't take other steps to protect the prey. Because we think we have a solution. That's the opportunity cost. Here's how that played out in practice. This was a report from a county, Marin County in California, Groovy County, that outlawed lethal coyote control. And here was what the producers reported. We've pretty much learned how to control coyotes on our own, said Jensen, whose losses to coyotes have declined 60 to 70%, from about 50 lambs a year when a federal trapper worked there to 15 to 20 today. Anything that can help you 24 hours a day, like electric fencing, is a good thing. Electric fencing was invented long ago. Could have put up electric fences any time in the last many decades. And it decreased the losses, but didn't do it until it became clear that the other false solution was removed. This is my theory. This is why I believe that discontinuing reliance on lethal control is not just neutral for birds and wildlife, it's better because it removes a false solution and allows us to direct our attention to real things that might help. Even if they only help a little, they'll help more than something that's doing nothing. And sadly, creating a divide between groups that should be allies, cat advocates, wildlife advocates, public health advocates. Discontinuing reliance on random euthanasia of a fraction of free-roaming cats will free up time, resources, and focus to identify and promote successful solutions for wildlife and public health protection. Here's the practice. We could replace the time we're spending bringing in, euthanizing, caring beyond our capacity for care, dealing with crowding in shelters, with education for the public on steps they can take to really help. We can direct those resources to conserving habitat that's important for wildlife in every single community. If there's no other solution, we can focus our resources on identifying those critical habitats in each community where it really is important to remove all the cats. And there may actually be resources to do that by non-lethal methods. Even if lethal methods are used for a few cats to protect critical habitats, that's so much better and is so much fewer cats impacted than the random euthanasia that we're practicing now with no benefit to any animal. And here's the practice for public health. The same thing. Cats aren't the only ones pooping out hazardous things into our gardens, so even if we did eradicate all the cats, still wouldn't protect people from raccoon roundworm infection, which also can be fatal. So teach the public to wear gloves when gardening, wash their hands after playing in the dirt, cover sandboxes, wash fruits and veggies, avoid undercooked meat, treat pets for parasites routinely, make it easy for people, let them know what they can do, and that will protect them all the time from all the hazards that are out there. So we've knocked out most of the list, and we're down to the big brass ring. And if you've been following the logic, you can probably guess where this part is going. Here's the reality. This is a picture of community, cat, and shelter dynamics in the United States, and the graph for Canada looks darn similar. This red part is outdoor community cats, unowned cats that are out and about. This is outdoor pet cats. They're also out and about, at risk, pooping, predating, doing the things that cats do, breeding if they're intact. This purple piece of the pie is cats impounded and euthanized, and this green piece of the pie is cats impounded and released alive. You can see we could take out this purple piece of the pie, and it wouldn't make any difference to this, wouldn't make any difference to wildlife, wouldn't make any difference to human health, and it would make all the difference in the world to us. And it would allow us to make that green piece of the pie bigger. If you take it from an annual to a daily basis, each day in the United States, an estimated 1 out of every 15,000 free-roaming and outdoor pet cat in the United States is euthanized in an animal shelter. The other 14,999 are still out and about. We will never get ahead of the 8 ball at that rate. By 2 months later, when we've removed 60 out of 15,000 cats, we will have another 60, and we'll still have 15,000 cats. And that is why in shelters across the United States for so long, we've stalled out and been unable to make progress in further reducing euthanasia and intake of cats. So that's actually great news. Bummer, in a way, that we haven't been serving all of these goals, but this gives us the freedom to stop doing the one thing that has been hardest to do in shelters and start doing all the other things, each of which actually can serve every single one of these goals. So I liken impounding healthy cats in excess of the capacity for care and number released alive to using a hair dryer to hammer in a nail and a hammer to dry your hair. It doesn't work and it doesn't feel good. Let's pick up a tool that's well matched to the job at hand. How about we just stop? How about we just let that euthanasia table sit empty and we reserve euthanasia as a tool for cats that are genuinely sick and irremediably suffering? What could we then do? What hammer could we pick up and what nail could we hammer in? We could expand the options for live release for the cats that come into our care with shelter, neuter, and return. For cats that are unsuitable for placement into a home, but adapted to the environment in which they were living. We can put them right back out there to be a vaccinated, sterilized cat to keep occupying that niche in the community, helping the cat and stabilizing the population in the community. We can limit our intake to only those cats that can be released alive or for whom death is clearly the best alternative. We can say 14,999 out of 15,000 cats are already in the community every day, and exceeding our capacity for care doesn't make sense. Let's wait until we have room and assurance of being able to provide a live outcome. And we can take all those resources not spent on killing cats, and I use that term respectfully, understanding that euthanasia is not our intent. I mean, that euthanasia is our intent, but that killing is often what happens, on programs to benefit cats, wildlife, and communities. And that gives us the ability to reduce cat overpopulation, to lower our intake, to invest more resources, to build our capacity, to reach out into the community where most cats are being lost and rehomed and adopted, where they're breeding and thriving or not thriving, and make it so that there are fewer cats truly needing our care in the first place. And that means we have more resources to reinvent and repeat as necessary until we really are all done and have put ourselves out of a job. And this is a campaign that took place in the human healthcare industry. This is breaking news just for the viewers of this webinar today. This was a campaign to save 5 million lives from healthcare mistake-associated harm. So looked at the baseline for how many people were either being injured or killed as a result of healthcare-associated mistakes. That's a hard thing to look at because I hate to think that that happens at all. Even one is too many. But if you start looking at it, then you can start making a difference. And they identified 6 key policies, 6 key procedural changes that hospitals could make to reduce healthcare-associated mistakes. And then they issued this specific challenge. They said, some is not a number. Soon is not a time. Let's pick a time. Let's pick a number. Let's pick 5 million. And let's pick 2 years from now. And let's reduce from our baseline of expected lives lost by 5 million. And you can check out this website. They did it. They first tried it with the 100,000 Lives Challenge, and if any of you were at Expo last year, you know that we issued the 100,000 Cat Challenge. They exceeded the 100,000 Lives Challenge by over 30,000. They ultimately got over 4,000 hospitals. So this is just page 1 of 14 of all the hospitals that signed on to participate. All they had to do was document their baseline and then document their data during the 5 Million Lives campaign. So the Million Cat Challenge, breaking news, is a shelter-based initiative. So it's not about solving all the problems of all cats in the community, but it's about making the shelter system work. It's about balancing our intake with our capacity for humane care and our ability to provide live outcomes, whether that's by neuter and return, or by adoption, or by return to the owner. It's an opportunity for shelters to share their challenges, solutions, and successes. And the goal is over the next 5 years to reduce euthanasia by 1 million compared to our baseline. And this again is going back to how striking it is that the similarities between what we do, what we struggle with, and what the human hospitals had to face. The names of the patients whose lives we save can never be known. Our contribution will be what did not happen to them. Though they are unknown, we will know that mothers and fathers are at graduations and weddings they would have missed, and that grandchildren will know grandparents they might never have known, and holidays will be taken, and work completed, and books read, and symphonies heard, and gardens tended that without our work would never have been. And for us, we might not see the faces of the cats whose lives are protected by our work, because we might help resolve their situation by supporting a finder or an owner or a neighbor to resolve that situation without bringing the cat into our care. It might be a kitten that was never born because of our spay-neuter efforts. It might just be a euthanasia table sitting empty one summer morning in a community near you. So if you want to join, right now you can go to tinyurl.com and join the Fez project. You can email sheltermedicine@ucdavis.edu, and millioncatchallenge.com will be up and running soon, I promise. And that is the end of part 1